I left town for 48 hours to walk my daughter down the aisle, and when I came back, 3 living pieces of my childhood were gone. I don't mean that in the poetic way people talk about memories fading. I mean literally gone. Cut, removed, erased from the ground like they had never stood there at all. I remember the moment with a strange clarity because I was still wearing the same suit from the wedding. I hadn't bothered changing before driving home. My wife Marissa had stayed another day with our daughter and her new husband in Charleston, but I had school starting Monday and a stack of essays waiting to be graded, so I made the drive back alone late Sunday afternoon. I turned onto my street just before sunset, and something felt wrong immediately, though it took my brain a second to understand what it was. The skyline behind my house looked different. Too open, too bright, like someone had shaved the top off a familiar shape. I slowed the car without even realizing it. At first I thought maybe a storm had come through while I was gone. Sometimes the wind moves strange in these hills outside Asheville. Trees fall, limbs break, but as I pulled closer, I didn't see storm damage. What I saw was emptiness. When I rolled into my driveway, the first thing that hit me wasn't the view. It was the smell. Fresh cut wood. Rau sap. That sweet, almost vanilla scent you get when you split firewood in winter. Except this wasn't winter, and nobody here splits wood in July. I stepped out of the car slowly, still trying to convince myself I was misunderstanding something, and walked around the side of the house toward the backyard. Halfway down the path, my stomach dropped. The ground behind my house looked like a logging site, where 3 massive white oak trees had stood for longer than anyone on this street had been alive. There were now only 3 wide, pale stumps and a blanket of sawdust scattered across the grass like snow. The trunks were gone. The canopy was gone. The deep afternoon shade those trees cast over the back of my house every summer was gone. I just stood there for a long moment, holding my car keys in my hand, staring at the space where something enormous had once lived. Those trees were older than my parents, older than the neighborhood. My father used to say one of them had already been tall when the Civil War ended. When I was 12, I carved my initials into the thick bark of the smallest one with a pocket knife I wasn't supposed to have. My mother yelled at me for it, and then laughed because my carving looked like a crooked little wound in a trunk the size of a refrigerator. When I was 26, I stood under the biggest oak with a ring in my pocket and asked Marissa to marry me. Years later, we hung a tire swing from a low branch for our kids. Those trees had watched almost every important moment of my life. And now they were gone. The silence in the yard felt strange without them. Sound travels differently when a canopy disappears. But there was one sound that cut through everything else. Water. A steady, smooth, rushing sound coming from over the fence. I didn't need to look to know what it was. My neighbor Claire Hallbrook had installed an infinity pool the year before and built a stone water feature that spilled over the edge toward the valley behind our properties. I walked straight toward the fence line. Claire was floating on her back in the pool wearing oversized sunglasses, one arm draped lazily across the edge while water slid past her into the lower basin. She looked relaxed in the way people do when they believe the world is arranged properly around them. For a second, I wondered if maybe she didn't know. Maybe the tree crew had made a mistake. Maybe there was some explanation. Then she noticed me standing there. She lifted her head slightly and pushed the sunglasses up on her nose. "Daniel," she said, like we had run into each other at the mailbox. "You're back already. How was the wedding?" I didn't answer that question. "You cut down my trees," I said. The words came out flatter than I expected. She sighed and rolled onto her stomach, drifting closer to the edge of the pool. "Daniel," she said again, slower this time, like someone explaining something to a child. "Those trees were structurally compromised. I had a certified arborist evaluate them last week." "You still there?" "You had someone evaluate my trees." "From my side of the fence," she said with a small shrug. "They were leaning. There was rot in one of the lower limbs. If one of those giants came down during a storm and landed on my property, the liability situation would be complicated for both of us." I felt my hands grip the top rail of the fence without realizing it. They weren't diseased. My arborist disagreed. "Your arborist never stepped on my property." She gave me a small, patient smile. Emergency mitigation allows action when there's imminent danger. I could see the open valley behind her house clearly now, something that had never been possible before. The 3 oaks had filled that entire space with leaves and branches. From her second-story deck, those trees blocked a wide slice of the sunset every evening. We had talked about it more than once since she moved in 3 years earlier. At first, it had been casual comments over the fence while we were both outside doing yard work. "Have you ever thought about trimming those?" she'd asked one afternoon, gesturing toward the branches. They cast a lot of shade. I told her those trees had been casting the same shade since 1894, and nobody around here had ever complained about it before. She laughed when I said that, but it wasn't the kind of laugh that means someone finds you funny. Claire bought the old Whitman property the year after her tech company went public. The house had been a quiet red brick colonial built in the 1920s with ivy climbing up the walls. Within 6 months, she demolished it and replaced it with something she called a contemporary statement. Steel beams, floor-to-ceiling glass, limestone shipped in from somewhere in Italy, a rooftop deck with LED strip lights that glowed at night like a landing pad for spacecraft. The backyard transformation came next. For nearly 8 months, our neighborhood sounded like a construction site. Jackhammers, cement trucks, delivery vans unloading palm trees that had no business growing in western North Carolina. The final centerpiece was the infinity pool spilling toward the valley behind our properties. I remember the first evening it was finished. Claire invited half the street over for wine and appetizers while the sun set behind the mountains. Everyone complimented the view. Nobody mentioned the trees, but Claire did. She leaned against the railing beside me and said quietly, "Imagine how spectacular this would be if those oaks weren't blocking half the horizon." I told her they had been there long before either of us, and I wasn't interested in cutting them down for a sunset. She didn't say much after that. We stayed polite neighbors. We waved when we passed each other, but the tension settled into the space between our houses like humidity before a storm. And now here we were, 3 stumps, a pile of sawdust, Claire resting comfortably in the water like nothing unusual had happened. "You were on my property," I said finally. She lifted her shoulders slightly above the water. The permit paperwork was filed Friday morning. I was in Charleston Friday morning. That's unfortunate timing. Something cold moved through my chest then, not quite anger yet, but the early shape of it. I looked past her toward the valley again, now perfectly visible from her pool deck. "They weren't diseased," I said quietly. Claire didn't answer. She reached for the glass, sitting on the ledge beside her, and took a sip of something clear and sweating in the evening heat. For a moment, neither of us spoke. The water from her infinity edge spilled steadily into the basin below, a smooth, endless sound like rain that never stopped. I realized then that the open sky behind my house wasn't just empty. It felt wrong, like a missing tooth your tongue keeps finding. And standing there at the fence watching that water run, a thought slipped into my mind that I didn't fully understand yet. Claire hadn't just removed 3 trees. She had removed something that had been quietly holding this hillside together for longer than either of us had been alive. And I had the strange feeling that the land itself might not appreciate the change nearly as much as she did. Monday morning, the yard still smelled like fresh sap and sawdust. And the strange thing about anger is that it doesn't always arrive loud. Sometimes it shows up quiet and methodical. I woke up earlier than usual, stood at the kitchen window with a mug of coffee, and stared at the empty space where the canopy used to be. Without the trees, sunlight reached the back of the house in a way it never had before. The kitchen felt brighter, but not in a good way. It felt exposed. I kept expecting the branches to sway into view the way they had every morning of my life, but all I saw was open sky and the edge of Claire Hallbrook's glass house catching the early light. Marissa called around 8 from Charleston. "Did you make it home all right?" she asked. "Yeah," I said. Drive was easy. I didn't tell her right away. I don't know why. Maybe part of me still hoped I had misunderstood something. But after a few seconds, she heard the tone in my voice and asked what was wrong. I turned slightly so I could see the stumps again through the window. "The trees are gone," I said. There was a long pause on the line. "What do you mean gone?" she asked quietly. "I mean cut down. All 3 of them." Another silence, heavier this time. Marissa had lived with those trees almost as long as I had. She knew exactly what they meant to me. Did a storm, she started. No, I said. Claire. I heard her exhale slowly. Daniel, she said, but she didn't finish the sentence because there really wasn't anything else to say. By the time I hung up the phone, the quiet anger had turned into something more focused. The first call I made was to the city forestry department. Asheville takes its trees seriously, especially in the older neighborhoods, where canopy coverage is part of the zoning code. I explained what happened and gave them the address. The woman on the phone sounded sympathetic but cautious. I see an emergency removal permit filed for that property late Friday, she said. Emergency? I asked. Hazard mitigation. The filing states the trees were structurally compromised and posed a risk to adjacent property. I closed my eyes for a second. They weren't compromised. That determination would normally require inspection, she replied carefully. But emergency permits allow action if the arborist deems the threat immediate. So she just gets to cut them down, and that's it. There will be a review process, she said. But those take time. How much time? Another pause. Several weeks at least. Weeks. I thanked her and hung up. For a while I just sat at the kitchen table, staring at the grain of the wood, like it might rearrange itself into a solution. Eventually I grabbed my jacket and went outside. The yard looked worse in daylight. When you see something shocking the first time, your brain almost protects you by blurring it. But now the details were impossible to ignore. The stumps were enormous, easily 4 feet across. The pale rings exposed where the chainsaws had bitten through more than a century of growth. I crouched beside the largest one and ran my fingers along the surface. You could still smell the life in it. Sap glistened in the grooves of the cut, like something wounded. I heard a voice behind me. You're up early. Claire stood on her patio holding a stainless steel travel mug, dressed in athletic clothes like she had just come back from a run. Her house rose behind her in clean lines of glass and stone, looking like it belonged in a magazine spread instead of the hillside neighborhood built in the 1940s. I called the city, I said without turning around. Of course you did, she replied calmly. They told me about the emergency permit. Yes, she said. My arborist filed it. I stood up slowly. You never even talked to me. You were out of town. That's not the point. She took a sip from the mug and leaned against the railing. Daniel, if one of those trees had fallen during a storm and crushed part of my house or injured someone at a gathering, this conversation would be very different. They weren't dangerous. They were leaning. They've been leaning for 50 years. Her expression didn't change. Sometimes trees reach the end of their structural integrity. I looked past her toward the valley again. The morning light was flooding straight across the hillside now, unobstructed, the distant ridges glowing blue in the distance. Funny how the ones that happened to block your sunset were the only ones that needed emergency removal, I said. For the first time, her mouth tightened slightly. You're being emotional. You cut down 300 years of living wood while I was gone. I removed the liability. We stared at each other across the fence for several seconds. Finally, she pushed herself upright again. If the city decides there was an issue with the paperwork, my legal team will address it, she said. But I'm confident everything was handled appropriately. Then she turned and walked back into the house. I stayed in the yard a while longer after she left, looking at the exposed rings in the stump again. You can learn a lot about a tree from its rings. Wet years leave wide bands. Drought years leave narrow ones. Storm damage shows up like scars buried under bark. I remember my Aunt Eleanor explaining that when I was a kid. Eleanor had been a botanist at UNC in the 70s. She used to bring her grad students up here occasionally because the hillside behind our street had a unique mix of old-growth canopy and migratory bird habitat. They would wander through the woods with clipboards and binoculars, whispering about species names I couldn't pronounce. I hadn't thought about those visits in years until that moment, kneeling beside the stump and tracing the rings with my thumb. Habitat. That was the word Eleanor always used. Habitat isn't just a place where something happens to live. It's a structure, a system. Remove one piece and the balance shifts. That thought followed me inside and stayed with me through most of the afternoon while I graded essays at the dining table. By evening, I found myself walking down to the basement without quite deciding to do it. Our basement is mostly storage. Boxes of old Christmas decorations, photo albums, camping gear we never use anymore. In the far corner, there's a stack of cardboard boxes that belonged to Eleanor after she passed away 15 years ago. My parents had stored some of her research notes there temporarily, and nobody ever got around to sorting them properly. The cardboard smelled faintly of dust and old paper when I pulled the first lid open. Inside were folders filled with maps, typed correspondence, and field notes written in Eleanor's careful, looping handwriting. Most of it looked like academic clutter at first glance. Soil samples, plant inventories, survey diagrams from decades ago. I flipped through a few pages out of curiosity more than anything else. Then I saw a folder thicker than the rest with a title typed across the tab. Rigorous Urban Forest Corridor, Federal Cooperative Agreement, 1978. I sat down on the concrete floor and opened it. The document inside was dense with legal language, the kind that usually makes your eyes slide off the page. But as I skimmed through it, certain phrases started to stand out. Protected Canopy Zone, Ecological Corridor Designation, Migratory Species Nesting Patterns. I turned another page and froze. There was a map of the hillside with several parcels outlined in red ink. Our street, my property, Claire's property, and 3 small circles drawn almost exactly where the oaks had stood. My heart started beating faster as I flipped through the rest of the folder. Letters between Eleanor and the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Regional Office. Environmental Impact Studies. A conservation easement filed jointly between federal and state agencies that designated certain mature oak clusters as critical canopy habitat for monitored migratory bird species. Near the middle of the packet, one sentence had been underlined in Eleanor's pen decades earlier. Removal of designated mature canopy trees requires federal ecological review prior to any action. Federal review. I sat there in the basement for a long time, reading every page twice, the quiet hum of the dehumidifier filling the room while my mind slowly connected the pieces. Claire had filed an emergency permit with the city. Maybe that worked for ordinary trees. But if the corridor designation was still active, and nothing in these documents suggested it had ever been revoked, the trees she cut down weren't just landscaping. They were federally monitored habitat. I leaned back against a stack of boxes and stared at the exposed ceiling pipes above me. The anger I'd been carrying since yesterday was still there, but something else had joined it now. Not revenge. Not exactly. More like a sense that the situation had grown bigger than a dispute between neighbors. Claire had believed she was removing an obstacle from her view. But the land under both our houses had its own history written into federal agreements older than either of us realized. And if those agreements still meant what the documents said they meant, then the 3 stumps in my backyard might have just opened a door she never intended to walk through. The next morning, I woke up before the alarm, not because I had somewhere to be, but because my brain had already started moving ahead of me. When something unfair happens, the first reaction is anger. But after anger settles, something else replaces it. Curiosity, strategy, a quiet question that keeps repeating in the background. What actually happens next? I stood at the kitchen counter again, coffee in hand, looking out through the glass doors at the stumps. In the pale morning light, they looked even larger than they had the day before, like 3 pale scars pressed into the grass. For the first time since this started, I didn't feel helpless looking at them. I felt something closer to certainty. I finished the coffee, went upstairs to my office, and spent the next 2 hours scanning every document from Eleanor's folder into my computer. The old letters were brittle and yellowing, but the words were still sharp. Habitat Corridor. Migratory Species Oversight. Cooperative Agreement between the State Conservation Office and the Federal Wildlife Service. Every time the phrase Federal Review appeared, Eleanor had underlined it with the same dark blue pen she used on her field notes. When I finished scanning, I emailed copies to 3 places: the North Carolina State Conservation Office, the Regional Office of the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, and the Environmental Compliance Division connected to the EPA. I kept the message simple. I explained that 3 mature white oaks inside a designated canopy habitat corridor had been removed without ecological assessment and attached the historical documents along with photographs of the stumps. I had taken the photos myself that morning. Close angles, wide angles, measurements using a tape measure beside the trunk rings. When I finally hit send, it didn't feel dramatic. It felt procedural, like filing paperwork after a car accident. Then I closed the laptop and went to work grading papers because life has a strange way of continuing even when something big is unfolding quietly in the background. 3 days passed without any response. On the fourth morning, I was sitting at the dining table with a stack of sophomore history essays when a vehicle slowed in front of my house. I noticed it first through the reflection in the window glass. A dark green SUV pulled to the curb. Behind it came a white pickup truck with an agency seal printed on the door. I set my pen down. Marissa had come home the night before and was standing in the kitchen making coffee. "Dan," she said slowly, following my gaze toward the street. "Is that?" I nodded before she finished the sentence. 2 men and a woman stepped out of the vehicles. They wore field vests and carried clipboards, the kind of quiet, practical gear you see on surveyors or environmental scientists. None of them looked like lawyers or police officers. They looked like people who spend a lot of time outside. They stood near the sidewalk for a moment, scanning the properties on both sides of the street. Then one of them pointed toward the slope behind our houses. A few seconds later, they walked up Claire's driveway. From our kitchen window, I could see Claire come out onto her patio wearing sunglasses and holding a phone in one hand. She looked confused at first. The conversation started politely. I couldn't hear the words from inside the house, but body language carries its own language. One of the investigators gestured toward the hillside behind her property. Another opened a tablet and showed her something on the screen. Claire's posture stiffened. The woman in the vest then pointed directly toward the place where the oaks had been standing. 10 minutes later, there was a knock at our door. The same woman stood outside, mud already drying on the toes of her boots. "Daniel?" she asked. "Yes." She extended her hand. "Dr. Melissa Grant, U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service." Her voice was calm but direct, the tone of someone who has delivered complicated news many times before. "We receive your report and documentation. Do you mind if we take a look at the site?" I stepped aside and let her in through the gate. The 2 men followed her across the yard, stopping near the stumps. One of them crouched beside the largest trunk and ran his hand slowly across the rings. "Do you know how old this one was?" he asked without looking up. "Around 125 years, I said. He whistled softly. "That's prime canopy." I noticed Claire standing on her patio watching us now. The distance between our houses isn't large, maybe 40 feet of grass and fence line, so every movement in my yard was perfectly visible from her deck. The investigators spent almost an hour taking photographs, measuring diameters, collecting soil samples from around the stumps. At one point, Dr. Grant asked if I had any older photographs of the trees before removal. I told her I probably had dozens in family albums. "Anything with dates is helpful," she said. "We need to establish the maturity of the canopy before the removal." "Were they protected?" I asked. She paused before answering. "This hillside is part of a cooperative habitat corridor designated in the late 70s. Mature white oaks in this zone support several monitored migratory bird species." "Meaning?" I asked. "Meaning removal typically requires environmental review." She didn't say anything else after that, but she didn't need to. By the end of the afternoon, the investigators had walked both properties and the wooded slope behind them. Claire's pool area received particular attention. I saw one of the men measuring the distance between her stone patio and the property line, while another photographed the retaining wall that bordered the slope. Around sunset, the vehicles finally pulled away. Claire remained on her deck long after they left, her phone pressed against her ear while she paced slowly across the stone tiles. The next 2 weeks unfolded in a way that felt both quiet and strangely intense. On the surface, nothing dramatic happened. I still drove to school each morning and graded assignments in the evening. But small signs of activity appeared around Claire's property almost daily. Black sedans parked along the curb. Men in tailored suits walking the boundary line with tablets. Survey flags appeared along the slope behind the houses, bright orange markers sticking up from the soil like tiny warning signs. One afternoon, Claire intercepted me at the mailbox. Her voice was controlled, but the calm confidence she usually carried had faded slightly. "What exactly did you file?" she asked. I slipped the envelopes into my jacket pocket. "I filed the truth." Her jaw tightened. "My attorneys say the corridor designation is outdated." "Then they should read the renewal clause on page 14, I said. She stared at me like she was recalculating something important. "You're enjoying this, aren't you?" she said finally. I shook my head. "I would have preferred my trees." That answer seemed to land harder than anything else I could have said. For a moment, something like uncertainty crossed her face, but it vanished quickly. "This will blow over," she said. "These agencies always make noise in the beginning." Maybe she believed that, or maybe she needed to believe it. But 3 days later, the preliminary findings arrived in the form of a certified envelope delivered to both of our houses. Mine was labeled as the reporting party. Claire's was labeled as the property under review. I opened mine at the kitchen table while Marissa stood beside me. The language inside was careful and formal, but the message was unmistakable. The removal of 3 mature, white oak trees within the designated rigorous urban forest corridor, without prior federal ecological assessment, constituted unauthorized destruction of protected canopy habitat pending full environmental review. I read the sentence twice. Marissa looked over my shoulder. "What does that mean?" she asked quietly. I folded the paper slowly. "It means the situation just got bigger." Outside the kitchen window, I saw Claire standing in her driveway, holding her own envelope. She read the first page, then flipped quickly through the rest. Even from a distance, I could see the color draining from her face. And in that moment, it became clear that the 3 empty spaces in my backyard weren't the end of this story. They were the beginning. About a month after the investigators first stepped onto our street, the tension that had been building quietly finally surfaced. Until then, everything had happened through letters, phone calls, and people walking around with clipboards. But there's a point in any situation like this where the paperwork stops feeling abstract and starts becoming real. The knock on my door came just after dinner on a Thursday evening. Marissa and I had finished eating and were standing at the kitchen sink when we heard it. 3 firm knocks, not the casual tap of a neighbor dropping by. Something more deliberate. When I opened the door, Claire Holbrook was standing on the porch. She wasn't dressed like she usually was. No workout clothes, no sunglasses, just a plain sweater and jeans, her hair pulled back tightly like she had spent the whole day thinking about something unpleasant. For a second, neither of us spoke. I had seen Claire dozens of times over the past few years, but this was the first time she looked unsure of herself. "We need to talk," she said finally. Her voice was steady, but the confidence that normally lived inside it was thinner now. I stepped outside and closed the door behind me. Marissa stayed inside, but I knew she was close enough to hear through the window if voices started rising. The evening air was cool and quiet. Without the oak canopy, the sky above the yard looked larger than it used to, and the open darkness felt strange, like the house had lost part of its roof. Claire crossed her arms and looked out toward the empty yard before speaking again. "You escalated this beyond reason," she said. I leaned against the porch railing. "You cut down my trees. I had a professional assessment. You had someone you hired tell you what you wanted to hear." Her jaw flexed slightly. "That's how consultants work, Daniel." I didn't answer that because we both knew it wasn't the real point. She took a slow breath and stepped a little closer. "Do you understand what a federal restoration order could mean?" she asked. "My attorneys are telling me they could force the removal of the entire backyard installation." "You mean the pool?" "Yes, the pool, the patio, the retaining wall." I looked past her shoulder toward the glow of the water feature in the distance. Even from here, I could hear the soft rush of water sliding over the infinity edge toward the basin below. "You built a resort behind a protected habitat corridor," I said. "I built a backyard. You cut down 3 healthy trees to improve the view from it." She shook her head, frustration creeping into her voice now. "You're acting like I bulldozed a national park. Those trees were part of the corridor. That designation is ancient. It renews automatically unless it's formally dissolved." She stared at me, then in a way she never had before, like she was recalibrating the person she thought I was. For 3 years, I had been the quiet history teacher next door who waved politely and kept his yard tidy. I don't think she had ever imagined I might be capable of anything that complicated her life. "You could withdraw the complaint," she said finally. I shook my head. "It's not mine anymore." That was the truth. Once federal agencies open a case, the situation leaves the hands of the person who reported it. The system moves on its own momentum after that. Claire knew that. Her attorneys would have explained it. She rubbed her forehead briefly and looked out across the yard again. For the first time since I had known her, the certainty that usually surrounded her seemed to have cracked. "I worked my entire life to afford this house," she said quietly. "Do you know that?" I didn't answer. She continued anyway. "I grew up sharing a bedroom with 2 siblings in a place where the roof leaked every time it rained. Everything I have now, I built myself. When I saw this property in that view of the mountains, I thought, this is it. This is the place where I finally made it." Her voice softened slightly. "You see arrogance. I see the result of 25 years of work." I let that sit for a moment because I could hear the truth inside it. Claire wasn't lying. She had built something impressive from nothing. But that truth didn't erase what she had done. "I understand wanting something beautiful," I said. "But beauty that erases what came before it isn't really beauty." She didn't respond right away. She just looked toward the dark slope behind our houses where the forest still stood. Eventually she nodded once, almost to herself, and turned to walk back across the yard. Her heels clicked softly against the stone patio as she disappeared toward the pool. 2 weeks later, the official order arrived. The envelope was thick enough that I knew before opening it that this wasn't a minor notice or procedural update. Documents with weight inside them tend to change lives. Claire's copy arrived first by certified mail late that morning. I happened to be in the kitchen when the delivery truck pulled up outside her driveway. The driver handed her a large envelope that required signature. She tore it open right there beside the mailbox. At first, she read slowly, scanning the first page carefully. Then her eyes moved faster across the rest of the document. She flipped to the back, then returned to the beginning again, as if hoping the words might rearrange themselves the second time through. She stood there for nearly a full minute without moving. By early afternoon, another group of vehicles arrived on the street. This time there were more of them. 2 trucks from the Environmental Compliance Division, a survey vehicle, and a van carrying what looked like demolition contractors. The officials moved with the quiet efficiency of people who had already decided what the next steps were. Bright orange flags appeared around the perimeter of Claire's backyard, marking what the order described as the ecological restoration zone. The boundaries stretched farther than I expected. The flags cut directly across the stone patio. They surrounded the infinity pool. They even ran along the edge of the retaining wall that held the slope behind her property in place. The language in the order was blunt. Unauthorized destruction of protected canopy habitat within an active federal corridor. Secondary ecological damage caused by non-compliant excavation and impermeable surface expansion. Mandatory restoration to pre-development ecological baseline. In simpler terms, most of the backyard Claire had spent 2 years building had to be removed. The fine alone was $200,000, with additional penalties if the restoration timeline wasn't followed precisely. The demolition began about a month later. The first morning of the work, I woke up to the sound of heavy machinery backing down the street before sunrise. The irony of it struck me immediately. It sounded exactly like the morning the tree crew had arrived weeks earlier. Only this time, it wasn't my yard that looked like a construction zone. Concrete saw screamed as workers sliced through the stone edge of the patio. Jackhammers cracked the smooth surface that had once reflected sunset light across the pool. Eventually, they reached the infinity edge itself. When they broke through the outer wall, the water rushed out in a sudden muddy torrent, spilling down the slope toward the lower drainage channel. Claire stood on the far side of the yard, watching it happen with her arms folded tightly across her chest. I didn't feel triumphant watching it. I expected maybe I would. But the truth is I mostly felt tired. Justice doesn't arrive with fireworks. Most of the time, it sounds like machinery tearing something apart piece by piece. Over the next few weeks, the sleek resort-style backyard disappeared. The palm trees were hauled away first. Then the heaters, the lighting fixtures, the stone tiles, the metal railings. What remained was raw earth. Soon after that, a different kind of crew arrived. Soil specialists, environmental technicians. They spread erosion blankets across the slope and installed drip irrigation lines through the bare ground. Trucks delivered young trees in tall wooden crates, white oak saplings, red maples, dogwoods. One afternoon, Dr. Melissa Grant knocked on my door again. "We secured grant funding for partial replanting on your property as well," she said. "Replacement canopy species. Heritage grade." I nodded slowly. "They won't grow as large as the originals in my lifetime, will they?" She smiled gently. "Probably not, but forests measure time differently than we do." By early autumn, the hillside behind both houses looked nothing like it had 6 months earlier. Claire's backyard was no longer a luxury retreat. It was a restoration project under federal supervision. My own yard held a row of young saplings protected by mesh guards against deer. Standing there one evening, watching the wind move through their small leaves, I realized something important about the entire situation. Clara tried to reshape the land to match the life she wanted to see from her windows. But the land had its own story already written into it long before she arrived. And sometimes when you try to erase a story like that, the ending writes itself in ways you never expected.